This is a conversation with Dr. Bill Carr. He's been practicing psychology for almost 25 years, and I've always been curious about the ins and outs of psychology and how our mind works. And I want to talk to an expert who's had decades of experience diving into the deepest parts of their clients' minds and seeing what their issues are, what they're happy about and upset about, and helping to navigate them through that. So I asked Dr. Bill about some of the patterns that he's noticed, and here he shares them along with some of the best ways to deal with those patterns.
Dr. Bill Carr, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, Anthony?
Good. I'm doing well, thanks, other than having to go to the coffee shop for our conversation today.
Well, it's the
Um,
21st century, but the tech doesn't always support us.
yeah, we have to adapt.
Indeed.
Well, I appreciate you taking some time to talk to me. I guess the first question I would ask is, how long have you been practicing?
Okay. Well, about almost 25 years, but it wasn't my first career. I had worked
Okay.
in other things, but I was designing or helping to design computer systems for banks in the early 80s and decided that that wasn't going to be something I could stay with. But it did allow me to go to graduate school with some financial support. So I'm older than some people, but I think it was a real advantage having worked in the world for some years before going back to study psychology.
Nice. What advantage do you think it gave you?
A sense of what people's lives are like. When I was, what life is like, what adulting is about. When I was in school, a lot of the folks had just graduated from undergraduate school. They were coming for a master's and doctorate. They were 22 years old, and I was 38, and I had a considerable life experience.
Mhm.
Also, the loss of parents, to death, and other things that gave me a sense of what life meant. It wasn't
Yeah.
just about school.
You feel like you were able to go through things because of that you're able to like relate with the people that you meet with when they have the same issues?
Yeah, I think that happens in the sense that the more you know of living, the more you can relate to people's lives and their
Yeah.
living. Of course, I've been spared some of the serious damage that life can bring, and heartache and all. But life is not without heartache or loss. If you live long enough, you lose.
Yeah.
That's the way.
Um, I'm curious if you're doing a lot of, well, if COVID had changed the way that you're doing sessions and that it allowed you to do more virtual, have you made that switch at all?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. It's funny. My office lease expired in May 31st of 2020.
Hmm.
And no one was coming to the office anyway. And so I haven't gone back to the office.
That's pretty good timing.
Yeah, but I miss it. But at the same time, this is so much easier. There are people who have contacted me, though, miss on the site that says that I'm only doing virtual and aren't interested. They want to be, in person,
Yeah,
which is understandable.
sure. There is something to be said about missing a little layer there of the in person, but I feel like you are able to get you can communicate all the same ideas.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really about being a whole body in a certain sense. Reading body language is different.
Yeah.
It is, that there's distance and you're protected. When you're sitting in a chair and you are fully visible, you can't hide anything really.
The tapping of the foot, the nervous
Yeah,
twitches.
all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. How often do you normally wait in between sessions to see patients?
Do you mean during the course of an evening, or do you mean
Hmm.
most of my people I see weekly? One person currently I see twice a week, and there are several people with whom I've been working for a while who I see every other week.
Hmm. Do you
And
feel like there's,
I'm sorry, and
no,
there are
please.
people who will call every once in a while when they just want a refresher.
Yeah. And I assume that's pretty much person to person of what's best.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's a lot of different schools of thought, approaches, different methodologies to use when you're speaking with these patients and dealing with their issues. And I'm curious if there's one or a few that you prefer to look through when you're helping people. Do you know what I mean when I ask that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's important that you gather data in a certain sense, that you organize what you know about the person and ask the right questions so you know what you need to know to organize the data. I have found that psychodynamic theory helps to help organize the data for sure, to get to know the person. How did they come to where they are? At the same time, that may not be the treatment of choice. And there are people who respond well to cognitive behavioral treatment approaches, recognizing thought patterns that lead them to emotional experiences that don't serve them. And you try and help them recognize those distortions of thinking and sort of correct them. At the same time, for trauma, that doesn't really work. Because trauma makes thinking very difficult. When triggered, we now know the prefrontal cortex shuts down and the autonomic or sympathetic nervous system takes over. And the experience is one where it's very difficult to think or speak. You're just caught up in an emotional circumstance. So it's not this, you don't have the same capacity as someone who is, working through chronic depression.
And you mentioned cognitive behavioral methods don't necessarily work for trauma. Can you explain a little bit more about what those methods are or what that is?
Sure. Originally developed for the treatment of depression, the notion was that people get stuck in certain distortions, eliminating or ignoring the positive might be one, or focusing on a future or hopelessness about anything changing for the better in the future, that the future is just going to be the same as it is now. And so people get caught in a structure that talks them out of anything good and makes them feel depressed. And these patterns, all or nothing thinking, will do the same sort of thing. I either have to get it all, or nothing is worthwhile. And people can learn to recognize the style of thinking and particular thoughts that make them feel bad, that make them feel depressed or keep them depressed. And they can say, well, in life, there's good and bad. Just focusing on the bad is not. What about the good things that go on? And remind themselves of what's positive in their lives. And they notice then how the feelings will change as their thinking changes. And over time, if they practice, and there are worksheets they can fill out, and all of that, if they're willing to do that work. But either way, over time, they can change their thinking, and that changes their feelings and relationships to their lives and the people in their lives.
So taking almost an audit of what's happening around you right now.
Yeah, I guess, but mainly what's going on within you right now, what your thinking pattern is and how you're feeling and what triggers certain thoughts. So you are taking in what's around and become much more consciously aware of your patterns of thought, the feelings that result, and how somehow unrealistic some of that thinking actually is.
It seems to me from not being in the field, just observing from my point of view, that one of the most widely held issues is anxiety. Do you feel like
Mhm.
that's consistent with your experience?
Yes, anxiety
Okay.
is very difficult. But so what did you want to ask about that? Anything in particular?
I guess to start, could you help define what anxiety is?
Hmm. Anxiety is one of our human emotions which signals danger. It is
Okay.
often, this has been talked about in many different ways. I mean, Freud talked about anxiety all of the time and changed his mind several times about the nature of anxiety.
Hmm.
Uh, he thought that anxiety initially was caused by internal conflicts, but then he felt that that anxiety was protective and that signal anxiety would inform us of a circumstance to which we needed to respond. It's a signal, certainly, that we might be in danger. It's a signal that we are not safe, exactly. That that there are that brings worry and concern.
Hmm.
And anxious concern is very difficult because we don't know how to respond. You can get stuck in it, stuck in an emotional state of being, and anxiety will hold you captive and cause, in extremes, panic attacks. We literally think you might be dying.
Hmm.
People go to emergency rooms all the time thinking they're going to have a heart attack when in fact they're having an anxiety attack.
I've heard it described before as something has happened to you in the past, for example, where you were in extreme danger and now your brain still thinks that you're in danger even when you might not necessarily be. What
Well,
do you
as
think about that?
as a symptom of trauma, because it's what you're describing isn't anxiety. Anxiety is still the same feeling. We need anxiety. It's an important feeling.
Hmm.
There's one set of human feelings, and we all get them all for reasons because they are part of our system of paying attention and keeping ourselves safe.
Hmm.
People who experience anxiety, even as a disorder, um, don't necessarily have not necessarily experienced trauma.
Hmm.
Everyone I have ever worked with or known who has experienced trauma experiences anxiety.
Can you help clarify the difference?
Well, we have to define trauma. Sometimes people think of trauma as a kind of, like if you go to the dictionary, they might say a deeply distressing or disturbing experience.
Hmm.
And certainly it is. But trauma, real trauma, the trauma we understand changes brain, can change brain in an instant. Um, it is serious, deeply wounding, life-threatening,
Hmm.
exposure to danger or witness to life-threatening or to witness to death, violent death, something of that sort.
Hmm.
Uh, there are types of trauma. There is what you might call acute trauma, car accident, escaping from a fire. Um, uh, Certainly, when we talk about physical injury, traumatic injury,
Hmm.
it could, that could also have emotional consequences. But trauma uh, is serious. I mean, it's deeply wounding. And
Hmm.
when it happens, we become overwhelmed, sometimes dissociate from the moment. But the, the, the prefrontal cortex Now, this is stuff that they didn't know when I was going to school. This is the stuff that has come to light through the research, especially of this guy, Bessel van der Kolk. Bessel
Okay.
van der Kolk. You see, the body keeps the score. This book came out, I think, originally in 2014. So
I've heard of it.
yeah, it's an amazing thing. It's a good read. And if you're interested in learning about trauma, that's the way to go. You could say that when we have normal memories, they're organized by the prefrontal cortex. The smells of things, the sights of things, the feelings, all of this stuff is sort of put together by our prefrontal cortex.
Mhm.
And we have memories that have pictures and sounds and images of things that occurred. Trauma is not remembered that way. Trauma is remembered in emotions,
Mhm.
in body feelings, and especially anxiety and great fear. And when people start remembering things, sometimes then they can't talk, they can't even breathe. They gasp for breath and are filled with anxiety and can't form words. In the old days, when I was in school, I learned, you help people tell the stories of their trauma. That's how they get over it. And it never really worked. I mean, people might do it, but they might also start drinking or trying to escape. What we see with trauma, and this has been discussed in different ways now, is that we deal with trauma by flight or fight responses, freeze responses. Some people call it a fawning response. Other people call it an attachment response. But this idea of trying to get close and feel safe in the context of a relationship with another person. That's very difficult if that person happens to be your abuser.
Mhm.
But it happens in domestic violence circumstances where the person and finally the other way that we see people responding to trauma is submission, giving in, sometimes with dissociation. Imagine a child being sexually abused chronically over time, and how the brain forms around that. And with no explicit memories necessarily, but of all kinds of feelings triggered by anything in the environment or certain thoughts. Sometimes aware of the trauma, the person is triggered by the thought of the word trauma. I mean, there are all kinds of things, but what you can say is, what is said, that trauma holds you hostage, trauma hijacks you, and that the danger that you were in, that you experienced, is still experienced in the present as if it's the past, right? The timer is the prefrontal cortex. Without it engaged, once you're triggered and the trauma response is there, you could be past, present, it doesn't matter because you can't tell the difference. You're in the present, but there may not be any immediate danger,
Right.
So we have acute traumas, we have chronic traumas, where kids it can be direct, like that sexual abuse case I suggested. It can be indirect, kids growing up in a war zone. I remember hearing about traumatized kids growing up in a housing project outside of Chicago because of gang violence and guns and noise and, and their parents being terrified and not being allowed to go outside, and or being kept home from school. There is trauma from in domestic violence, and people are trapped in it, and they find ways to survive it. Trauma is probably better understood now than it has ever been. And there are many more ways of, people just to free the body. Yoga is employed. Mindfulness and meditation is employed. Some people have to work up to that, because if they just let their brain open, a lot of things will come to it now. And that can be re-traumatizing. So they have to be able to let it go easily. I mean, and that takes a lot of practice. Meditation takes practice to make it work. But there's all kinds of approaches now that look at the full range: mind, body, spirit, and how we can help relieve people of their traumatic history.
Trauma it can take the form of many different things. A lot of different things can happen to cause trauma, and then once it happens, the response to that trauma can also take the form of many different things.
That's right.
Do you think at the core of every unhealthy maybe thought or emotion or habit that we form, especially in later ages, do you think at the core of that is trauma from an earlier time?
Well, if there's trauma, that trauma is going to inform development. That trauma is going to inform, we all have a perceptual frame through which we understand and define reality. It's a frame built around our belief system, our learning, our education, our cultural heritage, linguistics, all kinds of things, how we see things, what we learned was right and wrong, what we believe to be so. If trauma is part of our heritage, part of our experience, it's going to contribute a great deal to how we see the world, for sure, and our experience all along the way. But
you say, sorry, go on.
Not just that most people, not everyone has experienced trauma, but there are a lot of ways in which people have experience and developmentally as kids growing up that leave them injured. And those injuries, emotionally injured, and those injuries produce ways of being in the world, ways of relating to others that can be problematic for them, but not necessarily related to trauma.
The question I was going to ask, and you've already answered, is do you think everybody has experienced trauma at some point? And you said no.
No. And even things that might be traumatic for one person aren't necessarily traumatic for another one.
Mm-hmm.
A person once told me about, the worst experience in their life is they were learning to drive, and they were driving on the highway. Mm-hmm. And they were driving their parents and an uncle and an aunt, and they were coming from something, and all of those people fell asleep. The whole car was asleep. Well, it was very quiet, and the person started to fall asleep and drowsing at the wheel going on the thruway or a highway, and said they opened their eyes and they were heading for the guardrail on the side of the road. So they righted the thing and jolted, and everybody was fine, but they woke up and what happened, and everything was all right. So the person sort of got away with it, but is that traumatic? Well, maybe it could be, but it wasn't for this person, and it was a lesson learned. Never ever to drive, and always be sure there's somebody there, or always, know that you can stay awake and do it. If you feel sleepy, pull over. Don't take risks like that.
Did you say they had reported to you that that was the most traumatic thing?
Yeah, that was the worst thing that ever happened to them. That's
Wow.
not bad.
No.
No.
Peace. Yeah.
That's not bad. So
That's good news.
yeah. So no, not everyone experiences trauma. And some things which might be traumatic for some would not be for others.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with the age of when the trauma happens to.
The Body Keeps a Score seems to be the authority in the field of trauma. What is it about that book that stands out so much?
Well, it's based on real research, doing brain scan work and seeing how people's brain reacts to triggers of trauma, if they've and that has really is singularly important. An awful lot of psychological theory is based on people, paying attention to other people. We know that some psychological research has not been easily duplicated, calling into question methods and such like that. A brain scan is a brain scan. It's very sometimes when we talk about evidence-based treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy is one. It's because the research that's done shows differences. It doesn't mean other forms aren't as effective, just it's hard to research them. To get data that you can analyze statistically and have it, be relevant. It doesn't mean the other things don't work. And depending upon how the research is done, the evidence, may be prevalent, but unless you really critically look at how it's done, then you don't know exactly. So, but the more medical, the more brain related, the more we are one thing, physical and spiritual and emotional, all at the same time. But if we can look at the brain and see how it responds, we can get some real information. So that's years and years of research. And based on what was found, approaches, the use of yoga, the use of meditation and mindfulness, the use of ways of talking about getting the person's brain engaged in a process around the trauma, over time reducing the power of the trigger to sort of shut them down and just be caught in an emotional, physical response to the traumatic past because of trigger. So you can, Joanna Fisher, a psychologist, written a book. She has a book out called The Legacy of Trauma, The Living Legacy of Trauma. And it is also a great stuff, and it helps focus the individual on their symptom sets, and considering that the purpose of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, is to protect us. So the thing that the instinct is driving are ways that helped us survive the trauma. It's not serving us now, but it did at the time. And so, but it is automatic. how can I say, especially if you grew up in an environment, say, where there was a lot of violence, people yelling, screaming, crying, and then that started you out, and then you were a target for some of that violence when you got older. Your brain is growing up and forming while you're in an environment which is traumatic from day one. Yeah? And if the people who are perpetrating the violence are the people who are supposed to protect you, you're in pretty tough shape because there's nobody to whom you can turn. And so it takes time to help people think through, to keep their mind active and engage the traumatic history without getting caught up in telling the story of it. Half the time, the story's not even remembered.
Yeah.
It's just, but helping them to understand that they've survived, see how that they've survived, and find different ways of dealing with it in the present. And it takes time, but it happens.
I imagine that would be one of the most difficult parts about helping people is when some of the things that they've dealt with, the issues that they have in their life have happened to them at times before they no longer have memories because they were so young. And so addressing a problem that they can't remember is quite the issue to overcome.
You bet. Things like, well, it shows up as anxiety, but abandonment fears because of neglect. You know, we think of abuse as being physical, sexual, emotional, but neglect, you know, those are active, but a passive form of abuse is neglect. And neglect can result with trauma. There's nothing to remember other than you're alone and terrified.
You said that often shows itself as anxiety and abandonment issues.
Yeah, well, anxiety is very common as a major, what would you say, a major symptom? Yeah, I mean, anxiety is often the trigger, how the system gets triggered. I mean, there's a sense of danger, and all of a sudden it's like like as if the siren went off, and all of a sudden the person is responding as if the trauma is about to happen again. That the danger that they knew then is happening in the present to them at that moment.
One thing that I have been told on this topic, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on, is one of the methods, there's many, but one of the methods to dealing with these issues is meditation. Yep. The reason being, because if you can bring yourself into the present moment, then you can remind yourself that those issues that you think are there that aren't, you can just look around and analyze whether or not they're actually there.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. It's just with this, but it takes time to get to that point. How can I say? When triggered, you are hijacked, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. So the meditation can't happen then. You practice the meditation independent of the triggering, right? So that perhaps when triggered, you can employ it. But you have to get good at it. It takes some time.
And the intention there is to train yourself to be able to regain control of yourself in those instances.
By sort of letting go, right? I mean, in other words, meditation often is a way of being grounded, right? Being centered. Thoughts and feelings come, but instead of grabbing onto them or responding to them and thinking about them and delving in, the idea is to let it go. You know, not to entertain it, not to think too much about it, not to sit with the feelings, but rather allow the feelings to pass, allow the thoughts to pass. You note them, you are aware of them, but you don't engage them in the same way. You return to focus on the breathing and just stay with that. Any thoughts that come, let them go. If you can focus on the breathing and you can relax and stay centered, then you have a way of allowing yourself some freedom from the triggering and from the persistent experience of the triggered symptoms. There's all kinds of things. You know, a fight response often has to do with, activities or yelling or engaging in, but a flight response could involve running away, but it could also involve running away through drinking or using drugs. It could also be a dissociation, feeling, distant from your own body, having out-of-body experiences. There's all kinds of other self-destructive behaviors. People do cutting sometimes, get caught up in that. I tell you this, I have worked with people who over the years have been diagnosed with all kinds of things: personality disorders, bipolar disorders, major depressive disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, anxiety disorders. And they're all true, and they have the symptom sets that reflect that, except they're all related to the trauma. That's how they developed. That's why they developed. And until you get to the trauma, they're going to suffer from all kinds of symptom sets.
Yeah. Something that, I've always been a pretty active person. I've also always been a very anxious person. And I find that exercise helps me a lot. Like after I'm done working out and I'm exhausted, that person that is exhausted I see the world so much more clearly. It's like I've just emptied all those feelings out of me. My thought in my head is that fight or flight feeling in my body that I get in my chest and my shoulders, fight or flight, either one, they both are requiring action from me. Fight, I'm action; flight, run, action. So when I'm exercising, I'm releasing that, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah,
is that pretty accurate?
Great. Yeah, and I think that exercise is terrific for a lot of things. And I can give you an idea though. And exercise is highly recommended for people suffering from depression, although depending how severely they're depressed, it's hard to motivate. But so anxiety might be a little bit easier because you're up and about anyhow a lot of the time. But anxiety in this sense is maybe a normal response to things. The future, we don't know the future. Can't tell the future. Sometimes anxiety is about not knowing. And when you're exercising, you're there. You have your plan. You're going to run 5 miles. You're going to do the bench press. You're going to do the things that you do. It's there. It is also focusing you away from anything else. It's like being in a bubble. And within that bubble, you are in charge, in command, doing what you need to do. And it's good for you. It's healthy, and when you're done, you're relaxed. Some things it doesn't work as well. I've worked with people from all kinds of experiences, and have talked to guys who, spent time in prison, and they would go to the weight room, they would go to the gym, and filled with anger and rage, because and they would exercise and punch the bag and lift the weights and exhaust themselves. But the next morning they got up, and again, it was all back, and they, so it just helped them get through, but it didn't change anything. So it all depends on what it is and who you are, and what kind. So for you, the exercise may help you absolutely control and deal with things better. If every time you exercise, it's initiated by the anxiety, until you exhaust yourself, you may not be getting to the heart of it, but it certainly is a decent and very positive way of helping yourself out, no question.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is more of a Band-Aid than a solution, but a good Band-Aid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because well, Band-Aids, keep you safe. They, block infection. They're good. But I don't know. It depends. Would you say, it may cure you after a while?
Yeah, temporarily.
Yeah. Well, or, I don't know. Maybe the things that, I could ask you. You don't have to answer. But what are your anxious triggers? What are your anxious thoughts? Is there a particular thought that is a frequent arouser of anxiety?
Actually, a good transition into the next question I was going to ask you about, if you have worked historically with any workaholics, because the reason I ask is because the trigger for me, the thought is like, I have to do more, I have to do more, I have to do more. No matter what I do is not enough. I could work 15 hours in a day and there's always more stuff I should be doing in my mind.
Yeah. When did this start?
As long as I can remember, I've been anxious.
But I mean, this idea about doing more, having to perform more and more.
Ever since I've been working, I started working when I was like 12, and ever since, might be sooner, but that's when I remember thinking it.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever felt, okay, well, that's interesting. And is it more or less the same now as it was then? I mean, the feelings in your body and the thoughts in your head?
Yeah, I definitely always have the feeling like more and more and more.
Yep. And because in order to prove something to somebody?
My goal is I want to have enough safety and resources to never have to worry about anything. And until I'm there, I feel I will always want that to push.
Okay. That's motivational for sure.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
No, no, not while I'm grinding.
Yeah. So you never feel taken advantage of by employers who sort of take advantage of your self-motivation?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. How much is enough?
I've never felt satisfied.
Okay. That question can be posed in a lot of different ways about a lot of different things. And does it, and if you are pleasing only yourself, I mean, and if we're talking about a bank account or a portfolio, that can get, really out of hand. There are people with, I don't know if you think that there is such a thing as too much money, but I expect there are people who feel much like you do, that there's never enough. There's never enough.
Yeah.
But is there? Do you have a number? I mean, do you need $1 billion? Will $1.5 million do? And some property? I don't know. I'm saying this and not trying to be flippant, but I'm not sure that whoever has the most money when they die is the winner.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
And there might be other joys that would give your life purpose and meaning that the money won't. This notion of safety, there were a lot of people bought into Bitcoin stuff, right? And then they lost a lot in the hope that, I had a grandfather who had retired, as I'm told, I never met him, but who retired in his 40s or something. I don't know that, and then in October of 1929, the Great Depression began with the crash of the stock market, and he had to go sell insurance to make a middle-class living because he had lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, that's a story, but the fact is that life is about a lot of different things. Money is a reality issue that we all need. One of the nice things is that we do get to decide for ourselves how much is enough, and find a way of managing that so that we can enjoy ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think I really the goal has always been entrepreneurial, to start my own business and fund it myself. The reason being, going back to safety, if I'm working a job, then I'm inherently relying on that company and that boss.
So is this fear-based? The anxiety is that if you stop working that hard, they might let you go?
That's certainly part of it. I mean, I wouldn't want to lose my job.
Well, why would you if you're doing the work? I mean, if you're doing what they ask you to do well, isn't that enough?
If I'm doing what they ask me to do well, isn't that enough? It's enough to keep a job, yeah, but it's not enough to satisfy the insatiable hunger in my stomach.
Okay, all right.
It's there's different parts to it.
Yeah. The hunger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny about that. I mean, how satisfying hunger is an interesting thing. And when people are poor and they can't afford food, right? Satisfying hunger is actually, the issue. But I expect if you're burning all those calories running and doing your exercise, that you get plenty to eat. So the hunger is for something else. But I mean, is it just the hunger for the number, or is it a hunger for something else? Like this? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna, I don't think it's a number that, I mean, the money is just a means to so I want to be able to provide for myself and the people around me to an extent where I don't have to worry.
Right.
I haven't put a number on that.
Okay. So that's that part. Do you enjoy your work? See, because workaholism is painful for a lot of people.
I enjoy the competition. I enjoy when I'm winning.
I see. Okay. Let me. Workaholism is interesting because it's an addiction, right?
Yeah.
And addictions are often people substitutes or a way of avoiding something,
Hmm.
right? When people with trauma get involved with drugs, that's a flight response, and often, they think it's helping. People who worry about relationships often get caught up in work so that their relationships, they don't have a lot of relationships, they don't have time for relationships,
I see.
friends or families. A lot of people are frightened that they know what work does for them. So they know that it's fine, but being home with kids and marital responsibilities and stuff makes them very uncomfortable. So, and they can say, well, I'm doing a great thing, working really hard, I'm making money. They don't have chance to spend it. So, because they're working so much. And so they can delight the family with material goods, such. It's nice, but it's not the
Yeah.
same thing as having a dad. Exactly.
Makes sense.
I'm just throwing this stuff out at you because you're struggling with this, it sounds.
Yeah, something I've been working on for sure.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, so some people will say that you've heard people say people change and some people say people do not change. In your experience, to what degree can people change? I'm sure the answer is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. People don't change for other people very often. That's I think, it can happen. Change is very, very hard. It's scary. People pursue it when they know it's necessary. People succeed because they get the support they need to do it. Sometimes that happens with a therapist. Sometimes that happens with family members. Sometimes new experience makes all the difference. Sometimes the new experience is had in the interpersonal exchange with the therapist. New experience promotes change more than anything else because of that perceptual filter I suggested earlier that we develop as we see the world in a certain way.
Mhm.
Unless we see the world differently, and we're going to see things the way we've always seen them. So sometimes new experience creates new learning and sort of changes the perspective a little bit. And once the perspective is changed, then you can see the world anew.
I like it. I have heard that change happens when the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of changing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what they say about procrastination too, right? When the anxiety of not doing of doing something is replaced by the anxiety of doing it. When the anxiety of doing something is replaced by a greater anxiety for not doing it, gets done. But yeah, I think that's right. There's all kinds of pain for sure. And I think that there's a kind of, I have people I've worked with who had to hit the wall before they said, I can't just pretend. I've got to take charge of this.
Without giving too many specifics, what's the largest leap of progress that you've seen with somebody that you work with, and what was it that helped them achieve that? Maybe it was a pain that they were experiencing.
Well, how can I say? I'll put it to you this way.
Okay.
There's no perfect parents, right? And in one sense or another, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, all parents wound their children. Sometimes the wounds are superficial and they make for a quirk of personality. But sometimes the wounds are deeper and there hasn't really been any healing. And the child who is injured, now maybe a young adult, has moved out away from home to go to school, maybe lives in a different city, but still responds to the parents in the same way, in hoping that they're going to recognize what they've done and at least apologize, which can be very healing. But sometimes they keep sort of poking the wound because they're not aware of it in a certain sense. The person they don't have a relationship where they can really talk about it. So sometimes people will engage with their parents and try to talk to them about these things. And if they hit the wall, they realize that they're not gonna, your parents don't even understand what they're talking about, or they are in denial of it, or, oh, it's, you've always been this way. So they have to learn to accept that their parents, for example, are who they know them to be, and that they can trust that they will continue to be themselves. And that understanding allows them, that acceptance allows them to change their expectations of how, and they can then enjoy what they can of their relationship with their parents and let the rest go. Now, that also allows them to have new sorts of relationships with other people. In other words, very often we look to other people to right the wrongs that our parents, to correct the relationships that we had with parents, prior relationships, prior significant relationships. There are attachment patterns that are formed. There are ways we continue to play out the same stuff with other people with whom we become close and intimate. Sometimes working through the parental relationship is freeing, so that new relationships can be based on well, who the person actually is, and not what you hope they'll do for you to correct the issues of relationships of the past.
Must be a pretty difficult thing to change your view of your parents after however many years of knowing them in that relationship, and all of a sudden accepting them for who they are if you haven't previously.
Right.
That's a big shift.
It is, and you have to unburden yourself a lot of the emotion, and there's all kinds of things. But part of what we now call adulting is taking responsibility even for the injuries inflicted on you by your parents, because blame, even when it's righteous, is useless. Because you're still stuck with whatever it is, and you're gonna have to figure out how to deal with it, or find somebody to help you figure it out.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious from your perspective, what is it like stepping? I mean, you've had, I think you said 25 years of experience, right? What is it like stepping into that office knowing that you are about to walk into the deepest parts of somebody's emotional stress and really not knowing what you're going to be going through or told on any given day?
Well, but I work with patients, clients for long periods of time, over time. So, but I can be surprised for sure. Especially, I do still some hospital work on inpatient psych units, and that's always surprising.
I imagine.
But I enjoy it. Part of my role is just be present and available to resonate with whatever the person in the room is going through. There's a kind of, very often it is through the expression of feelings that people grow and heal. And if they're hard, and it is hard often, having somebody there to help hold the feelings with you is and I have found a way, simply in my own way, to let it go home and enjoy my life and go back and do it again some other day.
Very nice.
There's everything human we all have. It's just different on the continuum of things. We have our own continuum for depression, our own continuum for aggression, our own even psychosis. Dreaming is pretty psychotic. Having the experience of flight, for example, and really experience as if you're flying, but you're lying asleep in bed. That's kind of out there. It's a loss of reality, certainly. Now, if you dream while you're awake, that could be in the red zone of psychosis. But along the continuum, there is nothing human that we don't all experience to a more or less extent. So we're all essentially the same, and we're each unique. There's a conundrum, but it works out okay.
I like that how you said it earlier. There's a set of emotions that we all have, and we just experience them in kind of different combinations and orders, but we're all feeling the same
and
thing.
For different reasons. What makes you angry might not make me angry, but the anger feels the same.
Yeah, that's insightful. We're all the same, but we're all unique.
Yep.
I've heard this question asked. I'm curious how you would respond to it. What is the goal of therapy?
Well, there's always a question. What is the role? What's the job? Some people feel they don't fit in the world. They didn't learn how to fit in the world, and they want to learn how to conform to what's appropriate, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are circumstances when that's probably an appropriate goal. But the larger goal, the more significant goal, as far as I'm concerned, is to help people become their most authentic self. Where if they want to think outside the box and not conform, that's okay too. Not everyone can do that. Most of us, are in the world, and we focus on how to accomplish what the world thinks is important. And that's okay too. I mean, that's fine. And you can do both. I mean, you find ways of being your authentic self within the work that you do and all of that. I think that becoming a psychologist was very freeing for me in that regard. It's very different than designing computer systems for banks. Of course, there was a lot of, in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, just amazing things that had never been done before that changed the banking industry. So it was interesting. The technical solutions were interesting, but it wasn't really people oriented in the way that I liked.
Yeah. So finding your unique self is an important part of the process.
I think it is. I mean, your most authentic self, your real self, even if you find ways of expressing it that can be grasped and heard and accepted, it's still you. It's your voice, your unique voice. Yeah.
Do you ever think through the lens of, I've heard a little bit about this, internal family systems?
Yeah, it's interesting. Something I want to learn more about. It's interesting, all of this stuff. So I've been spending a lot of time, because of my, clientele, reading about and studying a lot of the new findings about trauma, and internal family systems seems like something that I want to read more about. It was obviously not something that was covered, when I was in graduate school, and I'm not well versed in it enough to discuss it.
Sure. It does seem like conforming to others is a big part of what everybody is trying to do on a daily basis.
Yep. Well, that's how we get along, mostly trying to please our parents, right?
Yeah. How would you define a fulfilled life, and what do you think the most important aspect to that would be, as far as you can tell?
Well, another sort of notion that seems very clear to me. So we have to be in charge of ourselves. Our lives are in our care. But the whole time, what's really most important, the prime directive of being a human being, seems to me, is connection, and not just that, but is connection and relatedness to other human beings.
Yes.
And that's where it is. That's where life is. In our friendships, in our love relationships, in our intergenerational relationships. If we can make our family members friends in adulthood, that's terrific. Right? Friendship is the greatest relationship of all, because it's the one where we allow ourselves to be known, and we have the experience of being known, accepted, and appreciated for who we actually are. It's not a front, that's why friendship takes time. That's why the deepest friendships we don't have so many of, because it takes a lot of time and investment in a way. But
to even find out who somebody is to accept them.
Yes, and they have to allow themselves to be known, and you have to allow yourself to be known. And it's not so easy, but the trust and acceptance when you get there is a most meaningful thing. But I think that's where the deal is. I think that's where the life is, in our connection to others, how we relate to them, and how we experience being accepted based on someone knowing who you are, because we've allowed them to know. That's the best thing. That's what I think.
I agree. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate your time today. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Be well and good luck. Don't be so hard on yourself. It'll be okay.
All right, thanks. Talk soon.
Bye.